Oh, that's right.
He doesn't actually want me to say anything.
No, it's muted, sorry. Yeah, switch it off. Wait, hang on.
At the bottom.
Well, yeah, sorry about it.
Okay. So my talk for today is on international corporate governance and firm value. And for better or for worse, or maybe for just a complementary perspective, most of the literature I'm going to be talking about today comes from the finance literature. So either get excited or bear with me for the next 20 or so minutes. Just to motivate my talk, if you look at data on corporate valuations, one of the immediate things that you see is that there's substantial variation in corporate valuations around the world, in spite of the process of financial market globalization that's been taking place over the last 20 or so years. To take sort of an extreme example, if you look at countries other than the United States in 2006 and focus on countries that have a reasonably large number of domestically listed firms, what you see is that the average value of Tobin's Q ranges from about 1 in countries like Malaysia and South Korea all the way up to over 2 in Denmark. There's also substantial variation in valuations within countries. And the obvious question is why? Well, there's many different explanations that researchers have focused on. My talk today is on corporate governance, so I'm going to focus on the corporate governance piece. It's not to say the other issues aren't equally important, it's just not what I'm talking about today. Okay, so research in corporate governance is largely about trying to understand the mechanisms which help to mitigate the agency conflict between insiders and outside investors. There's many different possible definitions of corporate governance that you can find in the literature. A definition that's probably most appropriate for my purposes is one found in a review paper by Schleifer and Vishny in 1997. And it says very simply, it's very straightforward and it's rather stark, it says that corporate governance deals with the ways in which suppliers of finance assure themselves of getting a return on their investment. Now, we can think of many different corporate governance mechanisms. I've sort of divided governance mechanisms into those sort of at the country level and those at the firm level. The main research question that I'm focusing on today is the literature that looks at the question, does corporate governance affect firm value? There's a couple of good reasons for why we might expect to see a causal relation between governance and value. One is simply that better governance limits insiders' ability to expropriate. As a result, outside investors expect to receive a higher fraction of the firm's cash flows. As a result, they price protect less and are willing to pay a higher price for the firm's securities. Better governance also increases firms' ability to finance their growth opportunities, both via better access to capital and through a lower cost of capital. My focus here is largely on the international literature. There are a number of questions that are related to sort of the main research question that I'm talking about. I'll mention some of these in passing along the way, but I'm not really going to focus on them in any detail. One of the curious things about the international corporate governance literature is there's no clear definition of what researchers mean when they say, I'm doing research on international corporate governance. There have been special issues published in the JFE and JFQA in the last few years, and when you look through them, there's no explicit definition of what we mean. The older literature tends to mean that I'm doing research on corporate governance in a country outside of the US. And even today, some of the sort of the newer studies have that perspective. For the most part, though, when people say they're doing research on international corporate governance, what they really mean is they're doing some kind of cross-country study that's motivated based on sort of the law and finance paradigm of Laporte et al. Laporte et al. Emphasized sort of legal rules and protections for minority investors. And so I'm not going to hold myself to pinning down a definition of what international corporate governance is. I'm just going to focus on studies that use cross-country data and are sort of motivated in this law and finance paradigm. There's a number of advantages of doing a cross-country study. We gain substantial variation, which improves the power of our tests, and we can learn something from these kinds of studies. There's substantial variation in both the nature and the severity of the agency conflict across countries. There's substantial variation in the laws that protect minority investors. There's substantial variation in economic outcomes. And we can also have the opportunity to study groups of firms that are purely domestic versus those that have chosen to somehow cross a border. So for the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus on sort of three pieces of the governance and value literature. I'm going to talk a little bit about studies that focus purely on country-level investor protection measures, and then I'm going to move on and talk about firm-level governance. Now, there's many different ways that firms can improve their governance. I'm going to focus on sort of two sets of studies, those that look at governance indices and those that look at cross-listings. And in each case, I'm not going to go into any detail on the papers. I'm just going to say, here's the key idea, here's the empirical approach, and here are some of the key questions and limitations. So let me get started. Studies that look at country-level investor protection. The research question is well-defined and straightforward. Are firm values higher in countries that protect investors better? This question, as I said earlier, is motivated by a long series of papers by Laporte et al., who stress the importance of laws that protect investors. The empirical approach is very simple and very straightforward. You typically estimate a cross-sectional regression with a measure of firm value as your dependent variable, typically Tobin's Q or some proxy for Tobin's Q. And then they have a variable that proxies for minority shareholder protection, and then some control variables to make everything else equal. So I'm not going to try and talk about all the studies. I've just put up a couple here. Probably the first study to look at this in a really systematic way was a paper by Laporte et al., published in the Journal of Finance in 2002. They have sort of, for our purposes, two key results. One key result, looking at multiple measures of investor protection. They find that firm values are higher in countries with common law, and they find that firm values are higher in countries that score better on their anti-director rights index, which is basically an index of corporate laws. A more recent paper published last year is doing a similar analysis, except they throw in a whole battery of different proxies for investor protection. And they find that in general, their investor protection proxies are positively associated with firm value. Now, I've seen the title for Greg's slides, and so I may not need all of this, and I'm sure he's going to elaborate on some of this. But even as somebody who does research in this area, there's a number of obvious questions and limitations from these studies. First of all, we have the conclusion, investor protection matters. Well, what is it that investors really value? Is it corporate law? Is it securities law? Is it financial reporting and disclosure, or something else? Can we really assess causality from such a study? These measures, in particular, some of the measures put together by Laporte et al. Have been criticized by many different authors, including legal scholars, saying, look, these things have measurement error, there's coding errors. Are these measures really comparable and relevant across countries? These criticisms are all perfectly valid. At the same time, researchers have used a large number of different proxies for investor protection, and we sort of consistently get the same result. One of the advantages of doing a cross-country study is that you have substantial variation across countries. One of the disadvantages of doing a cross-country study is that you have substantial variation across countries. We want to isolate the impact of governance on value, and to the extent that we're successful in controlling for everything else, we can do that. But because there's so many differences across countries, we're often not successful in that, and very often our regressions have an omitted variables problem. The final limitation of these sorts of studies is, yes, they're interesting and they address an important question, but they ignore a lot of interesting within-country variation. And so that leads me to the next set of studies that look at firm-level governance. The research question here is very similar. We know that firms can choose to adopt governance mechanisms over and above what's required by the home country. There's many ways that firms can do this. I'm not going to be very specific about it in the rest of my talk. I'm going to focus only on broad governance indices and the choice to cross-list in a foreign country. Okay, so with sort of the recent interest, or over the past 7 or 8 years, in corporate governance, a number of investment banks and financial institutions have started compiling corporate governance ratings. So CLSA, so Credit Lyonnais Securities Asia has one, S&P has one, Institutional Shareholder Services have one. Each of these indexes has advantages and disadvantages. None of them are perfect. Some of the disadvantages have been discussed in the literature. I'm not going to go through this in any detail. Our empirical approach is basically the same. Estimated cross-sectional regression, the measure of value as your dependent variable, and a measure of firm governance on the right-hand side. Again, this isn't a comprehensive list of the papers that have looked at this, but these are sort of two of the first papers that I know of that tried to use a governance index to address this question. So a paper by Clapper and Love, published in 2004, and a paper by Durnev and Kim. These papers focus mainly on the CLSA ratings. The papers are broader in that they look at not just the valuation implications, they also back up a step and look at the governance choice. I'm sort of brushing that part aside. These papers have 3 key results. One is that they do document a positive relation between firm value and firm-level governance. They also find, like the country-level studies, there's still a role for country-level governance to play, but probably the most interesting result from these papers is that better firm-level governance seems to be valued more highly in countries with poor investor protection. So these papers are nice because they complement the country-level studies, and they add an additional dimension looking at firm-level governance. These papers have a number of difficulties, some of them not their fault. The CLSA ratings are limited in the sense that they cover only firms from emerging markets. So you lose some of the interesting country variation. As researchers, we don't get to choose which firms the rating agencies cover. It turns out the rating agencies cover firms based on how large the firms are and how interested investors are in these firms. So that creates a selection problem. There's an obvious endogeneity problem. Whenever you look at a governance paper that tries to establish a link between governance and firm value, you can always be critical about an endogeneity issue. Firms choose to have better or worse governance. There's a measurement error using these firm-level governance measures. We are estimating cross-sectional regressions. We don't know when a firm adopted a particular governance mechanism. They may have adopted a particular governance mechanism in response to some firm or country characteristic several years ago, and that may have changed by the time we observe things in the data. In terms of looking at these broad indices, we don't really get a good sense of which elements of governance actually matter. There's been sort of a flurry of newer studies using governance indices, using the ISS governance ratings. These ratings focus on a large sample of firms from mostly developed countries, and these 3 papers here do take a shot at addressing some of the questions that I've listed here. Okay. In addition to measuring governance through firm-level indices, we can also use cross-listings as a proxy for better governance. There's a large literature now that studies cross-listings. There's been many theories or explanations offered for why firms cross-list or why they benefit from cross-listing. But in recent years, the literature has paid a lot of attention to the governance and disclosure implications of cross-listing, in particular to cross-listing on a U.S. stock exchange, where firms have to register with the SEC and to a certain degree are opting into elements of the U.S. regulatory regime. If you want to compare the cross-listing studies to studies that use governance indices, there's a number of advantages. One is that we can use sort of the universe of firms from around the world, and we can construct a relatively long time series. So this allows us to get around some of the endogeneity and other issues that plague the indices studies. There's some disadvantages as well, okay? So this is where I get to talk about some of the research I've done in a paper published in 2004 that I co-authored with Andrew Caroli and Renee Stoltz. We provide one of the first analyses of cross-listing that sort of moved beyond the traditional event study methodology that literature had focused on. And we estimate a cross-sectional regression similar to the studies that I've mentioned earlier. In terms of valuation, our paper has three key results. One is that foreign firms listed in the US do seem to have higher valuations, and we called this the cross-listing premium. We found that the premium is higher for firms from countries with weak investor protection, and we found that the premium is higher for firms that have better growth opportunities, consistent with sort of the other governance papers that I've discussed. Now, there have been many questions and criticisms of our paper. One of the initial things that people discussed was, well, what's the role for enforcement? It's a legitimate concern. It doesn't invalidate our message or what we're saying. It simply says, look, there's a limit to how much a listing in the US can improve governance and disclosure. And actually, in the last couple of years, there have been a number of large settlements paid by foreign firms to US investors and via the SEC. One of the other questions is, okay, so what matters? Steve was talking about this yesterday. Is it formal legal institutions or is it monitoring by market intermediaries? Our original study focused on cross-sectional data only. There's again an obvious endogeneity issue. Firms choose to cross-list, some firms choose not to cross-list. We attempted to deal with that, but the availability of good instruments is limited. Other papers have suggested that the cross-listing premium is a temporary phenomenon. Others have noted that cross-listings in other markets around the world are also important. And most recently, sort of the debate has been about what's been the impact of Sarbanes-Oxley. In a more recent paper with Andrew and Renee, we attempted to address some of these concerns. We expanded our data set, so we have a panel going from 1990 through 2005. We also added in data for listings in the UK. Because we have a panel data, we can address some of the concerns about endogeneity, and we can address some of the questions about whether the premium is temporary or permanent. One of the interesting results here is that every year from 1990 through 2005, we find both an economically and statistically significant for firms with cross-listings on a US stock exchange, but in no year do we find any significant premium for firms with a cross-listing in the UK, either in the main market or in AIM. I have to qualify that with saying we can't look at AIM very much just because we don't have very much data on AIM firms. And an obvious question is, why such a difference? Well, many elements of listings in the UK and the US are similar. The key distinction comes down to governance and disclosure requirements. When firms go to the US, they have to register with the SEC, as I mentioned. When firms go to the UK, even on the main market, most of the apparatus and regulatory system that's designed to protect investors in the UK does not apply to firms with a foreign listing in the UK. The last thing I'll mention briefly is the cross-listing premium before and after Sarbanes-Oxley. Some people have looked at the cross-listing premium and tied it into the debate about whether or not the US capital market has become less competitive as a result of costs associated with SOX. The idea is that most of the provisions of Sarbanes-Oxley apply to foreign firms with registrations with the SEC, and if the costs exceed the benefits, then we might expect to see that the governance benefit of a US listing is lower after SOX. And so we have the data to look at this in our paper. I presented a graph with simple univariate results. We have more sophisticated statistical tests in the paper, but this tells the story. When you look at the average premium before and after SOX, there's no evidence of any sort of statistically significant difference. And if you take out 1999, which is arguably an anomalous year for valuations, the difference is absolutely tiny. And so our conclusion from this was, or at least our contribution to this piece of the debate was, there's no evidence that the cross-listing premium is lower in years since Sarbanes-Oxley. So I'm just going to wrap up now. What does this literature tell us, and where are we? Well, there's clear evidence of a positive association between governance and value. So our basic hypothesis has some nice evidence. Some of our more refined hypotheses are also supported by the data. At the same time, a skeptic can still argue that nobody has clearly demonstrated a causal relation between governance and value. This is particularly problematic in the studies that use governance indices because they have cross-sectional data and we lack good instruments for governance. One of the questions that people seem to be more interested in now is which aspects of governance matter? Which aspects of firm governance, which aspects of country governance do investors value? How do these things interact? And how generalizable are these results? It seems that one of the limitations of a cross-country study is that the agency problem, the agency conflict differs across countries, and so the governance mechanisms that investors might value could very well be different across countries. And so if we really want to understand which governance mechanisms do investors care about, we may find ourselves going back to sort of the traditional single country study, trying to get more detailed data on governance choices, or trying to exploit settings where we can somehow get at this in a better way. So that's all I have to say, and I'll pass it on to Darius.